Disclaimer: the following narrative is a work of fiction for entertainment purposes. Charlotte, Preston, Bennett Capital, and every other person, business, document, and incident in this story are fictional. Similarities to actual people or organizations are unintended. Hello, everyone. What if the man you helped survive his worst year became rich enough to rewrite that year without you in it? Charlotte's answer will be quieter than the revenge others might expect. If stories about marriage, memory, and earned respect speak to you, subscribe. Is being erased from shared history a betrayal? Tonight, above Manhattan, a pregnant wife arrives carrying a gift from the years when her husband had almost nothing. The sentence Charlotte Bennett was never supposed to hear began with the sound of champagne touching crystal. At 8:52 p.m., 38 floors above Manhattan, Charlotte stood outside the half-open conference room door at Bennett Capital with one hand beneath her 8-month pregnant belly. She had arrived early to surprise Preston. Tonight was supposed to celebrate the largest deal in company history, and she had brought the vintage watch he once sold during the desperate years when Bennett Capital could barely make payroll. She had spent months finding it. Inside, men laughed. To Preston, someone said. Glasses clinked. From almost broke to millionaire kingmaker. Hell of a decade. Charlotte smiled faintly. Then an investor asked, "Where's your wife? She never seems involved in these decisions." Preston laughed. Charlotte recognized that laugh immediately, the smooth, effortless one he used when he wanted a room to believe nothing could touch him. Because she isn't part of them. Another chuckle. Charlotte stopped breathing. Preston continued. She's my wife on paper, nothing more. The gift box suddenly felt heavy in her hand. Someone inside shifted uncomfortably. That's cold, Bennett. It's practical. Ice moved inside Preston's glass. The marriage was useful when I needed credibility. I don't need it anymore. Charlotte's fingers tightened around the velvet box. Oliver moved beneath her ribs, one slow pressure against her palm. For 6 years, she had believed Preston's distance was ambition. Late meetings, missed dinners, phone calls taken behind closed doors. She had defended him because she remembered the man before the tailored suits and magazine covers. The man who once sat beside her on an office floor at 2 a.m. with unpaid invoices scattered around them and whispered, "If I ever build something real, it'll be because you stayed." Charlotte stepped backward before anyone could see her. Her champagne blonde hair brushed her shoulder as she turned toward the empty hallway. No confrontation, no shattered glass, just the muted bass of the celebration beating through the walls like a second heartbeat. She entered the women's lounge and locked herself inside. Under the white light, her sapphire blue eyes looked almost unfamiliar. She opened the velvet box. Preston's old watch lay inside, scratched along the bezel exactly as she remembered it. He had sold it 6 years earlier to cover part of an emergency payroll shortage. Charlotte had wanted tonight to give him back a piece of the life they survived together. Now she wondered whether he remembered surviving it with her at all. Her phone buzzed. "Preston, where are you? Everyone wants to see you." Charlotte stared at the message. Everyone. Not him. Everyone. Another message appeared. "We need the family photo before the press leaves." Family photo. Charlotte looked down at Oliver. Something cold settled beneath the pain. She returned the watch to her handbag and walked toward the celebration. Preston spotted her immediately. Tall, immaculate, dark ash-brown hair perfectly styled, steel gray eyes bright with victory. There she is. He crossed the room and kissed her cheek. Cameras turned. "You okay?" he whispered. Charlotte looked at the man who had just called their marriage useful. "Perfect." Preston placed an arm around her waist. "Flash. Smile for me." Charlotte did. Flash. On the giant screen behind them appeared the words, "Bennett Capital, built from nothing." Charlotte stared into the cameras, while one question replaced every other thought. 6 years ago, when Preston had been close to losing everything, he had begged her to help save what remained. So if she was nothing more than a wife on paper now, when exactly had he decided to erase the woman who helped him become the man standing beside her? Before Preston Bennett became the man who claimed he built everything alone, there was a winter when he could barely afford to keep the lights on. 6 years earlier, Bennett Capital occupied 3 cramped rooms above a printing company in downtown Manhattan. The carpet smelled faintly of dust. The radiator rattled. At 1:17 a.m., Charlotte sat beside Preston beneath fluorescent lights while unpaid invoices covered his desk. He was 35 then, brilliant, exhausted, and 3 weeks away from missing payroll after an investment collapsed. "I'm done," Preston whispered. Charlotte looked up from the spreadsheet. "No," he laughed bitterly. "Lottie, there's nothing left. There's cash coming in. Not enough." Charlotte turned the laptop toward him. She had spent 4 nights rebuilding his cash flow model after finishing her own job at a family-owned logistics company. "Because you're paying vendors on schedules that don't match receivables. Renegotiate these 3 contracts, delay this expansion, and stop treating projected revenue like money already in the bank." Preston stared at the screen. "You did all this? You asked me to look. I asked you to tell me whether I was doomed." Charlotte smiled. "You're not important enough for doom." He laughed then. A different laugh. Warm. Grateful. 2 days later, Charlotte called an investor named Richard Hale, a regional businessman who had worked with her employer for years. She did not promise Preston would succeed. She simply said, "Meet him before you decide." Hale did. The investment that followed was modest, but it bought Bennett Capital time. Time became contracts. Contracts became growth. And growth eventually became the company whose Manhattan headquarters now occupied 3 floors of glass and steel. At 10:06 the morning after Preston's celebration, Charlotte sat alone in their Connecticut kitchen reading Bennett Capital's anniversary profile on her tablet. The headline said, "Preston Bennett, the man who built his second chance." She scrolled slowly. Failed investment. Near collapse. Recovery. Expansion. Acquisition. Not one mention of her. One paragraph stopped her cold. With little more than instinct and determination, Bennett rebuilt the company alone, developing the financial discipline that would later define his leadership. Alone. Charlotte remembered the spreadsheet. The vendor calls. Richard Hale. She remembered Preston sitting on that dirty office floor after Hale agreed to the meeting, pulling her into his arms. "If I ever build something real, it'll be because you stayed." Oliver shifted beneath her ribs. Charlotte placed her hand over him. Maybe magazine profiles simplified things. Maybe PR teams polished founders into myths because myths sold better than complicated truth. She almost accepted that explanation. Then she noticed the article had been approved by Bennett Capital Communications. Her phone rang. Samantha Reed, Preston's PR director. "Charlotte, sorry to bother you. We're preparing the 10-year anniversary materials, and I need approval for an old family photograph." "Send it." Seconds later, an email arrived. Charlotte opened the attachment. It was a photograph from Bennett Capital's first successful year. Preston stood beside her, thinner then, smiling with his arm around her shoulders. Beneath the image, the proposed caption read, "Preston Bennett with his wife, Charlotte, during the company's early years." His wife. Nothing about the nights she worked beside him. Nothing about the model. Nothing about the introduction that bought him time. Charlotte stared at the caption until the words blurred. Then she remembered something stored downstairs, a battered blue binder she had not opened in years. It contained the projections she created during Bennett Capital's worst winter. She rose slowly from the table. Preston had told a room full of investors that she was his wife on paper, nothing more. If that was the story he wanted people to believe, Charlotte was finally ready to see what the paper actually remembered. The blue binder had survived 6 years in the dark, and unlike Preston, it had forgotten nothing. At 10:31 a.m., Charlotte Bennett knelt carefully beside a cedar storage cabinet in the lower level of their Connecticut home, one hand supporting her 8-month pregnant belly while the other pulled aside old tax folders, framed photographs, and unopened moving boxes. Then she saw it. Faded blue cover, bent corners, a coffee stain near the spine. Charlotte carried it upstairs and placed it on the kitchen table. For several seconds, she simply stared. Oliver shifted beneath her ribs. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's remember." The first pages were covered in her handwriting. Cash flow projections, vendor schedules, notes from late-night calls, red arrows marking expenses Bennett Capital could postpone without destroying operations. A page dated February 14th contained 3 words she had written beside a disastrous forecast. "Stop expansion now." Charlotte smiled faintly. That Valentine's Day, she and Preston had eaten takeout noodles in his office because neither could afford the time for dinner. She turned another page. Richard Hale, Tuesday, 3:30. Beneath it, "Preston needs 12 months, not a miracle." The meeting that followed had bought him exactly that. Then something slipped from between 2 pages. An old printed email. From Preston Bennett. To Charlotte Morgan, her name before marriage. Subject: You were right. Charlotte unfolded it. Your restructuring plan saved us. Her throat tightened. Farther down. Hale would never have taken the meeting without you. I know that. Charlotte sat back. No interpretation required. No wounded memory trying to make itself larger than it had been. Preston had written it himself. She kept searching. A handwritten note appeared near the back, folded around an early Bennett capital projection. Lottie, none of this happens without you. P. Charlotte pressed her lips together. For the first time since the celebration, tears came. Quietly. Not because she needed credit for loving her husband when he was struggling. She had never kept score. She cried because the man who once understood exactly what she had done had later decided that forgetting it was more useful. Her phone chimed with another email from Samantha Reed. Additional anniversary materials for review. Charlotte opened the attachment expecting photographs. Instead, she found a draft interview package prepared for Preston's upcoming business profile. The document outlined his preferred founder narrative: early failure, personal resilience, independent recovery, self-made expansion. Then a paragraph about his marriage. During Bennett Capital's unstable years, Preston entered a practical partnership that provided personal stability while he remained singularly focused on rebuilding the company. Charlotte read it again. Practical partnership. Not love. Not sacrifice. Not even teamwork. She scrolled farther. Her role had been compressed into atmosphere. A wife somewhere in the background while Preston supposedly rebuilt everything through discipline and instinct. Charlotte's sadness hardened into clarity. This was not an old journalist getting the story wrong. It was a current communications package. Someone was preparing this version now. She forwarded the file to a private folder, then photographed the relevant pages of the blue binder for preservation. No hacking. No secret corporate files. Only documents already in her possession and materials sent directly to her for review. At 11:08, Preston called. Charlotte watched his name glow across the screen before answering. Hey, he said warmly. Samantha told me she sent the anniversary package. Just approve whatever photo you like. Charlotte looked at his handwritten note. Did you read the interview draft? A pause. Most of it. Do you like the way it tells the early years? Another pause. Smaller this time. It's PR, Lottie. They simplify. Charlotte's sapphire blue eyes settled on the words, none of this happens without you. Of course, she said. They simplify. After the call ended, she placed Preston's note beside the new interview package. 6 years separated the two documents. In the first, he remembered her. In the second, she had almost disappeared. Charlotte finally understood the real betrayal. Preston had not forgotten who helped save Bennett Capital. He had simply discovered that the story of a self-made millionaire sounded cleaner without his pregnant wife inside it. At the 10th anniversary gala, Preston Bennett prepared to tell 300 people how he had survived with nothing. Charlotte arrived carrying proof that he once knew better. At 7:41 p.m., the Grand Meridian Ballroom shimmered beneath chandeliers and soft gold light. A 10-foot screen displayed Bennett Capital, 10 years of vision. Charlotte entered wearing an elegant midnight blue maternity gown, her champagne blonde hair falling in loose waves around her shoulders. 8 months pregnant, she moved carefully through the crowd while one hand rested beneath Oliver. Heads turned. Cameras followed. Preston reached her near the entrance. Immaculate black tuxedo. Steel gray eyes. The effortless confidence of a man celebrating the version of his life everyone had been taught to believe. There you are. He kissed her cheek. Flash. You look incredible. Charlotte smiled faintly. Thank you. Preston glanced toward the photographers. We need a few family shots before dinner. Family. The word almost sounded rehearsed now. He placed his hand around her waist. Smile for me. Charlotte looked directly at him. I've been doing that for years. His smile remained, but his eyes changed. What does that mean? Nothing. Flash. Charlotte had left the blue binder at home. She did not need to carry it like a weapon. Knowing it existed was enough. Dinner began at 8. Miles Carver, Bennett Capital's longtime CFO, sat 2 tables away. He had been there during the desperate winter 6 years earlier. When his eyes met Charlotte's, he smiled warmly and lifted his glass. She wondered what story he remembered. At 8:36, the lights dimmed. Applause filled the ballroom as Preston walked onto the stage. 10 years ago, he began. Bennett Capital was an idea held together by ambition and bad coffee. Laughter. Charlotte remained still. Photographs appeared behind him. The cramped first office, Preston beside an old desk, the company's first major contract. There were nights when I had nothing except an idea and the stubborn belief that quitting would hurt more than failure. Applause again. Charlotte remembered those nights differently. 2 laptops. Unpaid invoices. Her handwriting across projections. Preston asleep against her shoulder while she finished another cash flow revision. Then came the sentence. I rebuilt this company from the ground up. Miles Carver stopped clapping. Charlotte noticed. So did Samantha Reed near the stage. Preston continued without hesitation. And I learned early that survival depends on never relying on anyone more than you rely on yourself. Something inside Charlotte became completely quiet. Not rage. Recognition. He was doing it in real time. Editing 6 years into a cleaner story while the woman he had edited out sat 20 feet away, carrying his child. When the speech ended, the room rose in applause. Charlotte stood because everyone else did. Preston descended from the stage surrounded by investors and reporters. A business journalist approached Charlotte before he reached her. Mrs. Bennett, quick question? Of course. The reporter smiled. What was it like watching your husband build all of this by himself? The ballroom seemed to narrow. Preston was close enough to hear. Charlotte saw him over the reporter's shoulder. His smile remained in place. Waiting, trusting her to protect the story. She could have destroyed the moment. She could have described the spreadsheets, Richard Hale, the vendor schedules, the nights Preston had begged her not to leave. She didn't. Charlotte rested one hand over Oliver and answered quietly. That isn't how I remember those years. The reporter blinked. What do you mean? Charlotte gave a small, composed smile. It means memory is usually more complicated than a speech. Behind him, Preston's expression changed. The cameras kept flashing, but his smile was gone. For the first time that evening, the millionaire who had spent years rewriting his beginning realized the woman he erased still remembered every page. The first person to remember Charlotte Bennett correctly was the man who had watched her save the company from 3 feet away. At 9:16 the next morning, Charlotte sat at the kitchen table with the blue binder closed beside her when her phone rang. Miles Carver. She hesitated before answering. Charlotte. His voice was careful. I hope I'm not intruding. You're not. I wanted to ask about what you said to the reporter last night. Charlotte looked toward the rain streaking the windows. Which part? That you remember the early years differently. Silence followed. Miles had been Bennett Capital's controller before becoming CFO. He had occupied the desk outside Preston's tiny office during the winter. Everything nearly collapsed. I remember them differently too, he said. Charlotte's fingers rested on the binder. Why are you telling me this? Because I sat there last night listening to Preston say he rebuilt the company alone. Miles paused, and I stopped clapping. Charlotte remembered. I saw you. You built the cash flow model we used during the turnaround. You pushed us to renegotiate vendor schedules. And Richard Hale took that first meeting because you called him. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. She had spent days wondering whether pain had made her memories feel larger than they were. Miles removed that doubt with 3 sentences. I don't want anything from the company, she said. I know. And I'm not claiming I founded it. I know that too. His answer came immediately. But there's a difference between claiming ownership and refusing to be erased. At 11:04, another message arrived, this time from Samantha Reed. Can we speak privately? Charlotte agreed to meet her that afternoon at a quiet cafe near Madison Avenue. Samantha arrived carrying a slim laptop bag and an expression stripped of its usual PR polish. I need to be careful, she said after sitting down. I'm not giving you confidential company documents. I'm not asking you to. Samantha nodded. But I can tell you about materials you were already sent for review. She opened the anniversary package. The language about Preston rebuilding alone wasn't accidental. Charlotte said nothing. Samantha continued. Over the last few years, the direction became consistent. Reduce references to family assistance. Reduce references to outside support. Emphasize Preston as self-made. Did Preston give that direction? Samantha hesitated. Sometimes directly. Sometimes through edits he approved. Charlotte felt something inside her settle. Not shock. Confirmation. And me? Samantha looked uncomfortable. References to your operational role became references to you as his wife. Charlotte glanced through the cafe window. People moved beneath umbrellas. unaware that 6 years of her life had just been compressed into one sentence. Why? The self-made story tested better. Investors liked it. Media liked it. And Preston. Samantha closed the laptop. He liked it too. That evening, Charlotte returned home to find an envelope delivered by Miles. Inside were copies of old meeting minutes and correspondence he personally retained from the early turnaround years. Nothing made Charlotte an owner. Nothing transferred Preston's company to her. The records simply confirmed what the blue binder already knew. Charlotte had participated in restructuring discussions, prepared operational projections, and facilitated the Hale introduction. On one old meeting summary, Preston himself had written, Charlotte's revised model adopted for Q1 stabilization. Charlotte sat slowly. Her phone buzzed. A notification from the business journalist who had questioned her at the gala. Mrs. Bennett, I'm preparing a longer profile on Bennett Capital's early years. Mr. Carver suggested the history may be more complicated than previously reported. Would you be willing to speak on record? Charlotte read it twice. Upstairs, she heard Preston enter the house. His footsteps crossed the foyer, then stopped. Charlotte. She looked at the blue binder, the old minutes, and the reporter's message. Preston had spent years turning memory into mythology because he believed nobody would challenge the cleaner version. Now the people who had actually been there were beginning to remember out loud. Charlotte locked her phone without answering the reporter yet. She was not ready to tell the world about her marriage, but she no longer needed to. The truth about Bennett Capital could stand without exposing a single private wound. And for the first time, Preston's greatest problem was not an angry wife. It was a documented past with witnesses. By noon the next day, Preston Bennett learned that history becomes dangerous only when the people who lived it stop agreeing to forget. Charlotte had not contacted the reporter. She had not called investors. She had not posted a single accusation online. Yet at 12:07 p.m., the journalist emailed again. Mr. Carver has agreed to discuss Bennett Capital's early turnaround on record. I'd still appreciate your perspective. Charlotte sat in Daniel Price's office in Manhattan, the blue binder resting beside her. She had contacted Daniel that morning for one reason. Before speaking publicly, she wanted to understand the difference between telling her own history and exposing information that belonged to Bennett Capital. Daniel read several pages, then looked at her. He had already told Charlotte to stick to her own records, her own work, and supportable facts. What do you want the interview to accomplish? Charlotte answered immediately. Accuracy, not revenge. If I wanted revenge, I would tell them what Preston said about our marriage. Daniel nodded. And you don't intend to? Charlotte placed a hand beneath her 8-month pregnant belly as Oliver shifted. My marriage is private. The company's published history is what they're asking about. At 1:26, Preston called. She declined it. He called again. Then a message appeared. Miles is talking to the press. Did you arrange this? Charlotte stared at the screen. No, 3 dots appeared. We need to speak before this gets out of control. Out of control. She almost smiled. Truth had become dangerous only because Preston could no longer control who told it. That afternoon, Miles met separately with the journalist. He described the failed investment, the cash crisis, Charlotte's operational model, and the Hale introduction. He did not call Charlotte a founder. He did not exaggerate her role. He simply refused to erase it. Then Samantha contacted Charlotte. Preston knows I spoke with you. Are you in trouble? He asked whether I gave you confidential documents. I told him no. Samantha paused. Then he asked why I told you about the narrative changes. Charlotte's fingers tightened around the phone. What did you say? Because you asked whether the omission was deliberate. Silence. And it was. At 6:40 p.m., Preston came home. Charlotte was in the library, reading the reporter's proposed interview topics. He entered without removing his coat. Miles gave them records. Records he says he can discuss, and his lawyer can sort out what is appropriate. Samantha is talking. She told me about materials I was already sent. Preston stared at the blue binder. And now you're meeting the reporter. I haven't decided. Then don't. His answer came too quickly. Charlotte looked up. Why? Because this becomes a story. It already is a story. You've been telling it for years. You know what I mean. Yes. She closed the binder. You're afraid someone else will tell it accurately. Preston's face hardened. I built Bennett Capital. Yes, you did. The answer surprised him. Charlotte stood carefully. You took the risks. You let it. You made decisions I never made. I have never claimed otherwise. She touched the binder. But you did not survive that winter alone. Preston looked toward the fire. Why does that matter now? Charlotte studied him. Because you made it matter when you decided the truth wasn't impressive enough. He said nothing. Did you tell PR to remove me from the early story? She asked. Preston's silence lasted 3 seconds too long. I told them to focus the narrative. Charlotte nodded slowly. There it was. So you remembered. Of course I remembered. The words escaped before he could soften them. Charlotte's sapphire blue eyes filled, but her voice stayed steady. That's worse. Preston looked at her. Lottie, no, she picked up the blue binder. For days, I wondered whether success simply changed the way you remembered us. But you remembered everything. You just decided I made your story less valuable. Preston opened his mouth, then stopped. Charlotte walked past him. At the doorway, she turned. I'll speak to the reporter. His face tightened. About us. No, Charlotte held the binder against her chest. About what actually happened. The next morning, she sent one sentence to the journalist. I'm willing to discuss Bennett Capital's early years, but I will not discuss my marriage. Preston had spent years believing the greatest threat to his legend would be an angry wife telling private secrets. He was wrong. Charlotte did not need to expose him. She only needed to stop helping him erase her. The article did not destroy Preston Bennett. It did something he feared more. It corrected him. At 6:12 a.m. on Thursday, Charlotte sat beside the bedroom window with the blue binder closed on her lap while Manhattan slowly brightened beneath a pale winter sky. She had barely slept. Oliver had been restless all night, pressing beneath her ribs as if he could sense the tension surrounding his mother. Her phone illuminated. The business profile was live. Charlotte hesitated, then opened it. There was no scandalous headline. No mention of the private conference room. No quote about being a wife on paper. Instead, the article reconstructed Bennett Capital's early crisis through interviews, surviving records, and the people who had actually been there. Preston remained the founder. The risk had been his. The company was still his achievement. But the mythology had changed. Miles described Charlotte's cash flow work. Richard Hale confirmed that he had taken the original meeting after Charlotte personally introduced Preston. Old meeting notes documented that her revised projections were adopted during the stabilization period. Then Charlotte reached the paragraph containing her own interview. I never built Bennett Capital, she had told the reporter. Preston did. But he didn't survive its worst year alone. Nothing more. Nothing less. Her phone began vibrating. Samantha, it's fair. Miles, that's how I remember it. Then Preston called. Charlotte watched his name until the ringing stopped. Across Manhattan, Preston stood alone inside his office reading the same article on a 30-inch monitor. The company had not collapsed. Markets had not panicked. Investors had not abandoned him. Yet one sentence seemed to hold him motionless. It was pulled from an email he himself had written 6 years earlier. None of this happens without Charlotte. Preston leaned back slowly. He had spent years polishing himself into a self-made man, and now his younger voice had returned to contradict him. At 9:03, Charlotte arrived at Daniel Price's office for a scheduled meeting. Preston was waiting near the elevators. You gave them my email. Charlotte stopped. I gave them a copy of an email you sent me. You knew they'd use it. I knew they asked what happened. His steel gray eyes searched hers. Do you feel better? Charlotte considered the question. No, that seemed to unsettle him. Then why do this? Because feeling better wasn't the point. She held the blue binder against her side. The truth was, Preston lowered his voice. Now everyone thinks I lied. Did the article say that? It didn't have to. Then maybe what bothers you isn't what they wrote. Charlotte stepped closer. Maybe it's that people can compare what you say now with what you said when you still remembered me honestly. Preston looked away. The elevator hummed behind them. I worked for everything I have, he said. I know. You make it sound like I didn't. No, Preston. That's what you did to me. Silence. The words landed without anger. Charlotte rested one hand beneath Oliver. You thought acknowledging help made you smaller. So you made everyone else smaller instead. Preston's expression softened, but Charlotte no longer needed the apology forming behind it. Ding. The elevator doors opened. Before entering, she looked at him once more. I never needed your company. I needed my husband not to be ashamed that I mattered. The doors began closing. Preston stood motionless in the hallway. Later that afternoon, Bennett Capital quietly updated its anniversary page. The phrase "rebuilt alone" disappeared. Charlotte's role was described accurately and proportionately. No victory announcement followed. No applause. That evening, Charlotte returned home, opened the blue binder, and found Preston's old handwritten note again. Lottie, none of this happens without you. For years, those words had belonged to a private memory. Now Charlotte understood she did not need the world to call her the reason Preston succeeded. She only needed the truth to stop calling her irrelevant. And somewhere inside the corrected history of Bennett Capital, the woman Preston had reduced to nothing more finally became neither hero nor footnote, only exactly what she had been. 3 months after Preston Bennett told a room full of investors that his wife was nothing more than paper, Charlotte held their son and realized paper had remembered her better than he had. Morning sunlight filtered through the windows of a quiet Connecticut house as Oliver slept against Charlotte's chest, one tiny fist curled beneath his chin. He was 11 weeks old, healthy, loud when hungry, peaceful now. Charlotte's champagne blonde hair was loosely tied behind her shoulders, and for the first time in years, there was nowhere she needed to stand for a photograph. She and Preston had separated before Oliver was born. There had been no dramatic courtroom war. Daniel Price handled the legal details while Charlotte focused on childbirth, recovery, and the strange work of rebuilding an identity she had gradually placed behind Preston's. Bennett Capital continued operating. Preston remained wealthy. The corrected business profile had not ruined him. It had simply removed one sentence from the mythology surrounding him, that he had done everything alone. Charlotte had returned to financial consulting part-time, working remotely with 2 family-owned companies struggling through expansion. The first time a client used one of her cash flow models, she stared at the spreadsheet longer than necessary. 6 years earlier, she had been good at this. She still was. At 3:20 that afternoon, Preston arrived to see Oliver. He entered quietly, no driver waiting at the door, no assistant calling ahead. His dark ash-brown hair was slightly less perfect than usual. Charlotte handed him their son. Preston looked down at Oliver, and something in his face softened. "Hey, buddy." Oliver opened his eyes, considered his father, then yawned. Charlotte almost smiled. For 20 minutes, they spoke only about the baby. Feeding, sleep, the pediatrician, ordinary things. Then Preston noticed the blue binder on the bookshelf. He became still. "You kept it." Charlotte followed his gaze. "Of course." Preston handed Oliver back to her and walked toward the shelf. He did not touch the binder. "I read the old emails again." Charlotte said nothing. "The meeting notes too." He looked at her. "I meant those words when I wrote them." Charlotte adjusted Oliver's blanket. "I know." Preston seemed surprised. "You know?" That was never the question. Silence settled between them. "Then when did I become this person?" he asked. There was no executive confidence in his voice now. No polished answer waiting behind the question. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. Once, she would have tried to rescue him from that discomfort. She would have explained his ambition back to him until it sounded forgivable. Not anymore. "That's something you have to answer." Preston lowered his eyes. "I'm sorry, Lottie." Charlotte's expression changed slightly at the old name. "Don't call me that." He nodded. "Charlotte." Oliver stirred between them. Preston touched his son's tiny hand, then stepped toward the door. "I'll see him Saturday. 10 o'clock. "Okay." Before leaving, Preston looked back at the binder. "For what it's worth, I know now that acknowledging what you did never would have made me smaller." Charlotte held his gaze. "No, but erasing it did." Preston absorbed the sentence, then left. Click. The door closed. Charlotte carried Oliver to the bookshelf and pulled down the blue binder. The cover was faded. The corners were still bent. She opened it to the first projection, then to the email. "Your restructuring plan saved us." Finally, she found the handwritten note. "Lottie, none of this happens without you." For years, those words had seemed valuable because Preston wrote them. Now they meant something different. They were evidence of a woman Charlotte herself had almost forgotten. The woman who could read numbers, solve problems, make difficult calls, and help build something without needing to own it. She closed the binder and returned it to the shelf. Not hidden in storage anymore. Not displayed like a trophy either. Simply kept. A record. Oliver began to wake in her arms. Charlotte kissed his forehead and walked toward the sunlit kitchen. Preston had once laughed that she was his wife on paper, nothing more. In the end, the paper remembered exactly who Charlotte had been, even after her husband chose not to. And she no longer needed him to remember for her.